So the structure of the class was weekly for an evening in Louisville. There were 12 women participants, facilitated by Tim Darst, and we focused on understanding the issues that surround us and then looking at what sort of action we could take in response to that. So here in this presentation, I'm going to focus more on my personal response and what I have continued learning. I am going to look at what we learned about Louisville, but I won't spend as much time on that as I did here for people who live in this area. So this is just a quick list of the people who shared with us in our class. So you can see it's a wide variety of folks from nonprofits, from the University of Louisville, and a few elected officials as well. We are in the midst of the Sixth Extinction, just to give us a context of where we are. And we know that there have been mass extinctions in the past, but this is the first time that an extinction is caused by one species. And we, the human species, are responsible for the sixth extinction that we are in the midst of now. So just a few quick pictures that exemplify that. Our population has skyrocketed, as we know, since the Industrial Revolution. And this graph was created in 2000, when the population was right at 6.5 billion, and now we are at 7.6 billion as of September of this month. In addition, with that, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has drastically risen. It is currently at 405 parts per million. So again, higher than what's on this graph. The forest area has greatly been reduced. This is just a 10-year snapshot from 1990 to 2000. There have been a few areas where forests have expanded, but mostly we've seen a drastic reduction in our forests. In addition, our freshwater use, used by humans has also increased greatly and continues to increase. Our species extinction is getting more and more severe all the time. It is currently estimated that one species goes extinct every 5 minutes. That's an equivalent of 100,000 species a year. In 15 to 40 years, it is predicted that all of the following species will be extinct: the polar bear, the chimpanzee, the elephant, the snow leopard, tiger, mountain gorilla, orangutan, giant panda, the rhino, and the koala bear. All of those will be extinct within my lifetime. And we know that global temperatures are rising. We talk a lot about keeping temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Well, you can see here that the best estimates are very slim. There's a very slim chance that we will do that. And even those best estimates would put us above the 1.5 degrees Celsius. The high estimates put us far above that. So this is just a snapshot of what we know, but just to remind us of where we are. And again, this extinction is happening because of us, because of our species. So the framework for our class was, in the midst of this dire situation, what can we do about this? What can our response be? And so that's when we started exploring environmental justice. And we defined environmental justice as a fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, which sounds wonderful. And I wish that that's the way that the world was, but it isn't. We know that the poor and the marginalized are much more impacted with the environmental burdens than those of us who are not poor and marginalized. Right now, 60% of African Americans in the United States live in communities with one or more abandoned toxic waste sites. And 71% of Latinos live in counties that have violated federal air pollution standards. And Latinos are more than twice as likely as Caucasians or African Americans to live in areas with elevated levels of air pollution. So we know that these environmental burdens are not being distributed equally. We also know that climate change is amplifying all forms of injustice: hunger, racism, poverty, inequality, deadly viruses, and war. Climate change is just amplifying all of this. So to begin, we looked at the roots of the environmental justice movement. And so we looked at Warren County, North Carolina. In 1973, the Ward Transformers Company knowingly dumped 31,000 gallons of PCBs, which is a cooling fluid that's used in electrical apparatus, on the side of roadways in 14 North Carolina counties. They did this so that their load would weigh less when they disposed of it properly. So this was just a money-saving measure. So the state looked at all of this contaminated soil on the sides of roadways and decided to create a landfill to house that contaminated soil. And the site that they chose was Chaco, a rural town in Warren County that was 75% African American. It had neither a mayor nor a city council. It had the highest majority of African Americans of all North Carolina's 100 counties, and it was also ranked as 97th in the GDP. So again, we're looking at a community that doesn't have a lot of resources available and doesn't have a lot of infrastructure without a mayor or a city council. But the residents were very concerned. They feared contamination of their groundwater, so they organized together, and religious leaders took a large role in that and started protesting the construction of the landfill. These local leaders soon connected with civil rights leaders, and that's when national attention was brought to this issue. And this was really the first time that there was a public display of institutionalized environmental racism. And that's when environmental justice and environmental racism really started to be talked about in this country. So there were 3 lawsuits, many public hearings, and lots of scientific studies, all of which resulted in a compromise, which was that the landfill would not expand. So what had already been dumped in this landfill would stay, but no more of this contaminated soil would be added to the landfill. The residents were still not satisfied. So in 1983, 10 years after the initial finding, it was discovered that water was in fact running below this landfill, and that groundwater had been contaminated, which is what the residents were concerned about in the first place. So that reignited this whole movement. It wasn't until 2003, though, that a program was put in place to actively eliminate the PCBs. So 30 years it took for this community to have somebody begin the process to eliminate this very toxic, harmful pollutant. So this Warren County case revealed this type of racism and injustice that had previously been unaddressed and unnamed. And since then, disempowered groups, primarily low-income, minority, and rural communities, have used this example as a template for voicing their concerns and for connecting the dots between environmental issues and civil rights issues. So in our class, we really wrestled with the interconnectedness of all of this, particularly as we saw it in Louisville. And we worked on sitting with the realities of multiple forms of injustice that are taking place when Earth is exploited. And it was very painful, but we really felt like we had to name our context and recognize the truth of where we are. Almost all of our speakers said that awareness is the first step to change. And if you aren't aware of how you are complicit in what you are trying to fix, it's very hard to make effective change. So that was our grounding. So what really came out of this class is that we all need to know our neighborhood. And again, the area that we were focusing on was Louisville. We focused on sharing information and responding with some sort of action. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of where I am in relation to Louisville, this is I-65 that runs north and south. Shepherdsville, where we have assembly, is right down here. The mother house is right down here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not actually, but along the west side of all of this is the Ohio River. So the Ohio River runs directly west to these neighborhoods and then up north. There were 3 areas that most of our speakers focused on in our class, and that was on chemical plants, coal plants, and pollution in the Ohio River. So I'll just touch on those briefly. Louisville is home to a number of chemical plants, including DuPont and Dow Chemical, and they're all on that western edge, right by the Ohio River. Rubbertown was formed on the western side of Louisville during World War II. The president, FDR, recognized that most rubber plantations were in Asia, where the rubber tree grows well. And that was problematic during World War II. So FDR selected Louisville to become the synthetic rubber producer for the war effort. And it did become the world's largest producer of synthetic rubber. There are a couple of reasons that Louisville was such a great spot for this. One was its access to the Ohio River for transportation. One was access to grain alcohol from the distilleries, which is crucial in producing synthetic rubber. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, there are many negative health effects that have come from that. Rubbertown is still there. It is still producing a number of chemicals, including rubber. There are news articles very often in the Courier Journal about the very toxic quality of Louisville's air. There is a strategic toxic air reduction program in place, but it continues to remain unfunded much of the time. In 2008, USA Today did a study of air quality in schools around the nation that were known to be or were thought to be in areas that had toxic air. So you can see all of these schools listed on the top here: Farnsley, Foster, Wellington, and Cane Run. Those are all on the west side of Louisville. And those all ranked in the first percentile of the 127,000 schools that were studied. You know, Cane Run was the 70th of these 127,000. St. Francis of Assisi at the bottom, that's a school on the east side of Louisville. So it's better. It's in the 3rd percentile. It's number 3,220. But still, in the grand scheme of things, that's really terrible. So if you don't live right next to these chemical plants, everyone in Jefferson County is being exposed to this and beyond. The next issue that we talked a lot about was the coal power plants. Louisville's electricity is still run 90% on coal. One of our speakers said, you need to realize that every time you turn on a light switch, you're blowing up a mountaintop. And that was sobering for us. This was a study done by Brookings in 2008, looking at the per capita carbon footprint for 100 cities around the nation. Lexington rated the worst at 100, the highest per capita carbon footprint. Louisville ranked at 96. What was surprising to me was that LA ranked as number 2, the second best. New York was number 4. And I mean, it makes sense. Those cities are much, much larger. So of course their per capita carbon footprint would be smaller, but also Western cities tend to rank much better because they don't use nearly as much coal in their energy production. Louisville has also been, it ties as the 10th most polluted city in the United States. One of the interconnected issues that we looked at was the health of the city. And this graphic was very striking to me. You can see there that along the western side is where you see that orange in particular. That's right where Rubbertown is. The life expectancy in that area is only 67 years. Whereas on the eastern side of the city, the life expectancy is 83 years. Granted, there are many factors that would contribute to this, but we cannot deny that the chemical plants and the coal plants are all congregated right there in that area where the life expectancy is 15 years lower than for other people on the other side of town. So we really encouraged those of us who didn't live in Louisville, we were really encouraged to look at what was going on in our own communities that we were unaware of. Many people in my class did not know that the air quality was so bad. Or if they did know it was so bad, they didn't know why it was so bad or what could be done about it. The third area that many of our speakers talked about was Ohio River pollution. I'm just going to check this chat really quickly. There's a question from Libby. Are the coal-fired power plants on the west side too, or just Rubbertown? Thanks, Libby. The coal-fired power plants are also on the west side. Good question. And again, much of that has to do with access to the Ohio River. So the Ohio River is the most polluted river in the United States. And that is because of a number of factors. There is an enormous amount of discharge from industry, particularly in Louisville, that goes straight into the river. If you think of the size of the Ohio compared to the size of the Mississippi, it's a much smaller river, but there is twice as much discharge from industry that's dumped directly into the Ohio than into the Mississippi. Granted, the Ohio runs into the Mississippi, but this is where it's coming from. There's also an inordinate amount of nitrogen-based fertilizer runoff that all funnels into the Ohio because of all of the corn and soybeans that are grown in this area. In Louisville, there's also an incredibly high rate of fecal matter that is deposited without being treated directly into the river. I was very surprised to learn that Louisville still has a combined sewer system. And this was horrifying to me. My dad worked for the San Antonio water system my whole life, so I actually know a lot about water systems. And my husband is a water treatment plant operator. So the three of us had a great discussion about sewage systems while I was taking this class. So Louisville's sewer system is still combined. So all of the residential sewage and all of the storm sewage goes into the same treatment facility. It also rains a lot here. And so when it rains and we have extra storm runoff, the city doesn't have the capacity to treat all of the sewage before it is released into the river. And so when we have storms, they often have to just open the gates and let it flow through. Otherwise, it would be backing up onto the streets and into people's homes, a mixture of storm runoff and residential sewage, which is just horrifying. There are efforts being made to mitigate this. The city is building underground storage tanks under downtown Louisville, but already the city has grown beyond the population that those storage tanks were intended for. So even when they are finished and they are able to hold some of that and treat it after the storm is finished, it still won't be enough for our current population, and the city is continuing to grow. So that's where a lot of the pollution in the Ohio River comes from. This actually hit very close to home for me. In 2016, I had the chance to go to New Orleans for the Green Faith Climate Convergence for young faith leaders. And on that trip, we worked with local individuals, survivors of Katrina, elected officials, residents of the Isle de Jean Charles, and lots of local fishers and crabbers and shrimpers to talk to them about how climate change was affecting their lives and livelihoods. On one particular day, we went to the Gulf Coast Science Research Center and we learned about the hypoxic zone. And you'll see there that the gray area is the entire Mississippi River basin for the entire United States. So you can see that the Ohio River runs in and all of these other rivers run in. You know, the Mother House is definitely right there in the middle of this river basin. Where I lived in Colorado is right there. You know, Wyoming is right there. So much of the United States ends up funneling into the Mississippi River. And it all runs down off the Louisiana coast. And now we have this hypoxic zone, which is a dead zone. There is little to no oxygen left in that entire red area because of the excessive nutrient pollution from human activities that's going on upstream in the Mississippi River Basin. Because of this hypoxic zone, there's a huge decrease in marine life. So all of the fishers and crabbers that we spent time with in New Orleans talked to us about how they can't make a living doing what their family has done for generations. And they're having to go further out into the Gulf, which is dangerous for them. It's more expensive with equipment, and they don't know how the marine life is managed out there. It hasn't been managed for harvesting that far out. And so there's all sorts of concerns about the sustainability of fishing further off the coast. In addition, there's a huge amount of land loss that happens because of this hypoxic zone. When there's not enough oxygen to support the marine life, there's also not enough oxygen to support the plants in the wetlands. And so as those plants die, the salt water goes further inland and continues to kill plants. And the wetland system is so quickly eroding all along the coast of Louisiana. The wetland ecosystem that took 7,000 years to build will be destroyed in one human lifetime. Right now, Louisiana is losing 1 football field's worth of land off its coast every 48 minutes. So in the time that we will be together today, in the time that we eat lunch together when we're all here at the Mother House, every single time we have one of these hour-long functions, they're losing a football field's worth of land. And again, there are multiple factors for that. It's not just because of the runoff that's causing the hypoxic zone. It's also because of the canals that are being dug for the oil drilling. But these issues are so closely connected, it's really impossible to tease out exactly what's responsible for what percentage. But regardless, this is us. This is what we are doing. This is a breakdown of the nutrients that are being delivered to the Gulf that are causing this hypoxic zone. It's phosphorus and nitrogen. And you can see all the green area is corn and soybean crops. And when I saw that sitting in this classroom in New Orleans, it hit really close to home. The blue part is the urban and population related sources, which is not that much. It's the green and the orange and the yellow that's all related to how we're managing our land, our crops, and our animals. And it's having a huge effect. I spent a lot of time with one crabber in particular. He and I had dinner together one night. And he said something to me that was very troubling. He said, "You can do so much for us, so much more for us than we can do for ourselves." And that did not sit well with me at all. And at the time I thought he meant, you all are young and you're organized and you really can have this great voice. And now I think perhaps he was talking more about the fact that we are the ones with whom the problem originates. By the time the water gets to him, there's nothing he can do about. It's killing the fish, it's killing the crabs. It's causing the coast to erode in such a way that when there are storms, there's less protection for everyone who lives inland. And so the storms that are happening more frequently and with greater intensity are also happening with less natural protection. So the question for us in our class was, do you know your watershed address? And do you know what's going on in your watershed? Here at the Mother House, we're part of the Salt River watershed, which flows into the Ohio, which flows into the Mississippi. And I've just barely begun to scratch the surface of looking at that watershed and looking at how we're working within it. I've done a few things with the Salt River Watershed Alliance, but not many, and I hope to do more with them soon. We talked about lots of options for responding to these problems in Louisville in particular. Some were increasing wetlands, increasing pervious pavement, reducing sewage dumping, and reducing runoff from roads and parking lots. Those were some of the problems that would help specifically with this hypoxic zone in the Gulf. In general, we looked at responses to problems in 3 different areas: legislative, communal, and individual. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the legislative because many of you, again, know much more about that than I do. I will just tell you a few things that were surprising to me about Kentucky. So there are some major differences between Colorado legislative body and the Kentucky legislative body. In Kentucky, there are no ballot initiatives. None are allowed. You also, no one can filibuster. There is a 30-minute limit on any speaker on the floor. There is also a funny rule in some surrounding states here, where if every elected official of one party physically leaves the state, then they can't hold a vote on whatever issue they wanted to vote on. So that has happened in Indiana and I believe in Ohio, where one party will just all get on a bus and leave the state to block the vote, which I laughed at first, but you know, I guess you do what you can. In Kentucky, though, that is also not an option. And when we had State Senator Morgan McGarvey with us, I said to him, all of these flaws are flaws in the system. This is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is a system issue. And so what do we do in the face of that? And he was not very hopeful. He said, no party is ever going to change this. So you just have to work within the system that you have. He finds hope within the courts, and he is really encouraging people to push for nonpartisan redistricting. That's where he found his hope. I found my hope in the fact that each of our elected representatives on the state level in Kentucky is allotted 1/3 of one staff person, and that's it. So every single time that we call or email, it goes directly to our representative or senator. He talked about how they get a stack of green slips from all of the phone calls, and it doesn't go to the staffer because there isn't essentially a staffer. The senator gets the green slips. And so he said, you can tell when it's a really important issue by how big your stack of green slips is. And everybody goes around and waves their slips in other people's faces. And so he said that's really a very effective way to make your voice be heard in Kentucky. We also looked at communal responses that have happened in Louisville. With each class, we asked our presenter to share a victory, and each one had a victory to share. There was the Citizens Alternative Plan that was in response to a trash plan that DuPont proposed. The DuPont proposal was defeated. The Citizens Alternative Plan was enacted. The Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Regulatory Program was created by citizens because of the unacceptably high levels of toxic chemicals in the air. It is still in effect, though it is currently underfunded. Duke Energy was trying to install another nuclear power plant in Indiana that many people resisted. It took 7 years, and they had to move the whistleblower out of the state and offer him legal protection. But it was blocked and that plant was not built. HB 227 happened since I moved here. This was an anti-solar piece of legislation that would have put in place a regulatory change that would decrease the financial benefits to homeowners who put solar on their houses and would increase the revenue to utilities. And it was a dramatic increase for the utilities and a dramatic decrease for the homeowners. Fortunately, there was enough resistance to it that it never made it to the floor. So that one was blocked, essentially. And then we know of the Bluegrass Pipeline that we're all more familiar with because of how active the Mother House community was in that effort. And our speaker, Tom Fitzgerald, who talked about the Bluegrass Pipeline, he specifically mentioned the Loretto community. And his quote was great. I wrote it down. He said, "That is the most kick-ass group of people who are not to be trifled with." And so it was at that point in the class that my hand shot up and I said, yeah, I'm with them. So I was pretty proud of us in that moment. But we really celebrated the power of community. I mean, look what we can do when we put our minds to it. It's really impressive. We also talked about the need for negotiated and radical responses. Some of these plans were really radical, others were very negotiated, years in process, but we need to call on both of those at different times. So we considered, what is our capacity to affect change? And again, it was Tom Fitzgerald who said, things are the way they are because we're comfortable with the current level of dysfunction. So if we want to change the way that things are, we need to become uncomfortable again. So that is what we looked at doing with our individual responses. We need to collect and collaborate. We really can change the world. But when we're looking at what we can do individually, our question was, how do we close the gap between our professed values and the way we act? And that's what guided our discussions about our own practices. We talked a lot about the 3 C's as we identified them, the 3 C's that stand in the way of personal change: cost, convenience, and culture. And every time we heard somebody say, well, that can't work because, it really fell into one of these categories. And it's true, change has a cost. There's often a financial cost when you're enacting some sort of big change. There's also an enormous cost if you don't. And so the way that I think about cost now is, what is my life costing someone else? I don't want my life to jeopardize anyone else's life. And I know that it does. And so what am I willing to pay? What am I willing to have cost to me in order to correct that imbalance? When we think about convenience, it's very hard to transition to something that is less convenient. Even if we don't buy into the quote American way of life, we still are a people that generally value efficiency. I know this is very true for myself. Sometimes efficiency is very needed and healthy, but again, at what cost? I often joke with people here, when Andy and I moved here, we were so excited that we would have a clothesline outside. And having a clothesline instead of using a dryer has been a huge learning curve for us because it rains here a lot. And so we have to time our laundry with the weather. And we also have to wash clothes early enough in the day to get them out and have them dry before they're covered with dew and smelling like mildew the next morning. So it's not convenient. It's a huge hassle, but it's something that we're committed to because we don't want to be jeopardizing another person's life just because we want to throw our clothes in the dryer. So we're very happy that we're now in a place that we can do that. And culture is difficult. Culture is very hard to change. And also we create our own culture. We create the culture of our families, of our neighborhoods, of our spiritual communities, even of our nation. And so if we don't like the culture that we are living in, it's up to us to change it. No one else is going to do that. So many of my classmates had a wide variety of responses to the class. Some worked on plastic reduction, whether in soliciting stores to stop offering plastic bags or talking with restaurant owners to stop offering plastic straws. Some worked on calling legislators. Others worked on information campaigns about the combined sewer system and putting notices up on Facebook about not washing clothes or running the dishwasher or taking a shower when it's raining outside, so that you're not adding to that increased water. For me, when I was considering what I should work on, I love what Joanna Macy says when she says, you should work on what is sticking in your consciousness like a burr that you cannot get rid of. So I thought to myself, what is sticking in my consciousness that I can't get rid of? And it is my carbon footprint. For years and years now, I've been hearing about how we need to reduce our carbon footprint, and I don't even know what mine is. So I actually had done all of the work. I had decided at the beginning of 2017 that I was going to measure this, so I did, because this is our context. Here you can see that from 2014, you can see what the United States carbon footprint was. It's that blue one in the first box. Then it's the gray one in all of the other boxes. So I won't go through these. You can see there how the United States compares mostly to groups of other countries. The second box is the entire European Union, where our footprint is much higher. The third box is 7 other developed countries, where our footprint is much, much higher. Down on the bottom, China's footprint now exceeds ours, but per capita, per person, we still have twice as high of a carbon footprint as a citizen of China does. We have 10 times as high a footprint as someone in India does. So this is our context, and we now have an administration that isn't not only not trying to actively reduce our footprint, but what had been put in place is now being taken away so that NASA is no longer able to monitor carbon and methane emissions from around the world. So with that being the context, I thought nobody's going to do this for me. I have to do this on my own. So I did. Like I said, I had already gathered the data, so I just plugged it in. I actually did this in several different calculators, and this was the one that I liked the most because it's the most detailed. It's not perfect by any means, but it doesn't matter to me if it's absolutely perfect or 100% reflective of where I am. It's good enough. It gives me a good idea and a base that I can then compare how my footprint increases or decreases. And I see that there's a question popping up. Libby asked what's the name of my calculator, and I should know that, Libby. I've looked this up so many times. I don't remember, but it's been printed in Elian before, and I can put a link to it when this is put on the Elian website. It's one of the first ones that comes up. It's very simple. I just looked back at my electric bills for 2017 and put in the kilowatts of electricity and the gallons of propane that we used. Then it went through a variety of sections. It allows you to enter 3 flights, which I took 3 flights in 2017. If you took more than 3 flights, that would get a little bit tricky, but it's doable. Then it asks you to enter your mileage for your car, which I had because of tax purposes, so that was very easy to look up. I skipped motorbike and bus and rail because we don't have those options here. And then I went to the secondary footprint section where it asks you to put in dollar amounts how much you spend on food and clothes and pharmaceuticals and internet and all of those sorts of things. This is where I find the biggest flaw in this system. It's not asking you if you buy local organic produce, it's just asking you how much you spend on food. So I do think that's a flaw, but it's not a flaw that's big enough to throw the whole thing out. So I put in all of my information and I thought, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I think this is gonna be fine. And I pushed estimate, and I was horrified at the response. I ran the numbers again at least 5 times to check and make sure that this was right. And it is. And you'll have to excuse me, every time I do this presentation, I think I'm not going to get emotional by looking at this. And every time I do, because this is my responsibility. And it's true that I'm slightly less than the country's average, but I am nowhere near where I need to be to get to that point of a fair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits. For weeks after I got this result, I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't even tell Andy what I had found. I was so overcome by pain and sorrow and embarrassment and grief. And it took me a long time to come to terms with, this is who I am. We live a fairly simple life. We don't drive a lot. We grow a lot of our own food. We make a lot of our own products. Our soap, yogurt, granola, beer, we make all of that ourselves. We buy pretty much everything second hand. And still, this is my responsibility. This is how I am complicit. Ecological privilege is legal, and I'm of the opinion that it shouldn't be. No one is faulting me for doing this. I could continue living like this and not have any legal repercussions to myself. But because I have that privilege, I also have an enormous responsibility. And I have to recognize the fact that we are experiencing ecocide, and my life is deepening that. In a class that I'm taking on sustainable living right now, we've been told a couple of times that the more that you care about the environment and climate change, the bigger your footprint is likely to be. And we were shown this graphic that shows that the top richest 10% of the world emits 50% of our carbon emissions. 10% is responsible for 50% of the emissions. The poorest 50% is only responsible for 10% of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. So I looked at this and I thought, well, where would I fit in within the world's wealth? So I found a calculator for that, and I am smack in that richest 10% of the world's population. So this is who we are. We are that richest 10% that's responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. Andy and I have made some changes, as you can imagine. We called our energy cooperative right away and had a representative come out to our house to do an energy audit of our house, so that, you know, recognizing that we rent and we're probably not going to put a solar array in the backyard of a house we don't own, there are things that we can do in the meantime, and they helped us identify those. We also are creating mindfulness cues for ourselves. So about 50% of our energy still comes from coal for our energy co-op. So we still have a large pile of coal here on the Mother House grounds. And so I went and gathered a lot of coal, and I chopped it up in small enough pieces that I could attach it to 50% of our light switches. So it's right there as a mindfulness cue that every time I turn on that light, I am taking coal from the top of a mountain somewhere east of us. We also are actively saving money for an electric vehicle so that whenever our Subaru dies its final death, we will be ready to pay for an electric car. The flying is the hardest part for us. We don't live near our families, and our sisters live overseas, one in Germany and one in Japan, and we're not willing to not ever see our families. So we are still flying, though we're very careful about how often we fly. And from what I've read, it looks like solar flights will be available commercially within the next 20 years. And so we've made a commitment to start saving now, knowing that those solar flights will be much more expensive, but that it will be worth it. That cost is something that we're going to embrace for ourselves. I was surprised to find out recently that only, I think it's only 10% of the world's population will ever fly. Yeah, 90% of the world's population won't fly. So that's a definite privilege that I need to pay more attention to. In this process of figuring out how to get my footprint from that first box to that third box, I spent a lot of time with Joanna Macy and her, the work that reconnects, and her cycle that she talks about of starting from a place of gratitude and then moving to that place where we honor our pain and fully experience that pain. And that's where I was stuck for quite a while. And it was through rereading Active Hope and spending a lot of time with Joanna Macy that I was finally able to move to that point of seeing with new eyes. And there I found the biggest surprise of all of this. I suddenly had so much more energy and so much more space in my life to move forward because I now knew what my part is. And since I was aware, even though it caused such horrible grief, it freed up so much of me. And I really felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt before. Recognizing that I can't fix all of this tomorrow, but I can fix it. This is something that is doable. Andy and I are actively looking for ways that we can build a home that is as close to carbon zero as possible. We're reading, we're looking into workshops, we're trying to figure out where we can make this happen. We've got solutions in place. Some are small that we're implementing right away, and some are larger, but this is possible for us to respond. I just had to take the first step to know what I needed to fix. And then that enabled me to move through that and plan and go forward. So I'd like to end our time today by reading a quote from Joanna Macy. It's 2 slides long, so just stick with me. We have to honor and own the pain of the world, recognizing it as a natural response to an unprecedented moment in history. We are part of a huge civilization, intricate in its technology and powerful in its institutions, that is destroying the very basis of life. When have people had this experience before in our history? We ask people to relate to what they experience by allowing ourselves to feel our pain for the world. We open ourselves up to the web of life, and we realize that we're not alone. The response that is appropriate and that this work elicits is to grow a sense of solidarity with others and to elaborate a whole new sense of what our resources are and what our power is. Why should we do this work? To prevent us from going into the future blindly and abdicating our chance to fully alive, to prevent us from dying before we're dead, to truly see the magnificence of life, and by being ready to experience our pain for it, and also to be willing to experience our capacity to meet the challenge. So my major takeaway from this Earth Advocacy course was that we do have the capacity to meet this challenge. We have the ability to see the magnificence of life and to not abdicate the chance to be fully alive. Around the world, people are responding to this call in exciting and creative ways. All we have to do is say yes and get on board.